Sabbath fast. Saturday, Sabbath, as we would call it Saturday today, the fast day, Sunday, the feast day. How did that get started? I mean, what's the story behind that?
Well, it actually grew out of the teachings of the first great Christian heretic, right? And that was Marcion. And he was excommunicated, I think around 144. But he viewed the God, the Jewish God, the God of the Old Testament, see, as this God that the Christians should despise and should do whatever they could to show their spite for this God and for this Jewish way. All right. So the idea of taking the Sabbath, which for the Jews was a joyous
Best day of the week.
The best day of the week.
Summit.
Take this day and turn it into a gloomy, sad day. All right. Fast on this day. Well, although the church threw him out, he founded the whole sect of the Marcionites, and at that time this was the major competitor to what we would call Orthodox Christianity. This was like a big split. But the Latin Christians, the Christians centered on the leadership in Rome, took this fasting idea and said, let's hold on to this one, and kept it. That's right.
Now, what about the Christians in the East?
Well, that was the real dividing issue, or one of the real dividing. Of course, there was issues of leadership and so forth.
And there was the nature of Christ and other things that came along. And
but the
So
Orthodox,
you wouldn't say that the seventh-day Sabbath was the dividing line between East and West, the dividing issue.
it became like the big hot potato between these guys, because over the next...
More than the nature of Christ?
Well, over the next roughly
its
1,000
time,
years,
probably.
That's what we see coming to the surface again and again. The idea was simply this, that the Greek Christians continued to view the Sabbath as a day of celebration. Even though they would still observe Sunday,
right.
they still saw the Sabbath as a day of celebration, and they would not fast on that, except for the Sabbath of Easter. All right? They would not fast on that day. So this thing was really sponsored by the Latin leadership at Rome.
And it became a way of controlling people. Keeping
Controlling
people.
the way you behaved on that
Right.
day.
Well, imagine
how you
if you were observant, Dwight,
Yeah.
and you were already fasting on Wednesday and on Friday, and now you add Sabbath. Imagine what that makes
the day
Sunday
has-
into.
Yeah.
Well, I just think, imagine you're a kid, and every Saturday
That's
you
the way
can't
I
eat.
think of it, yeah.
You would love Sunday.
You would live for Sunday. And just, yeah. Now the name Dragus.
Yeah, he is a very prominent Greek Orthodox professor, professor, at least at the time that we did his interview, at their seminary in Boston. He's somewhat of I think maybe a maverick even among
Because
Greek
he was very
Orthodox.
open.
Yes,
I mean,
he was
our
very
viewers will
open,
see this
yeah.
when they get to part 3, how open this Greek Orthodox cleric is
yeah.
about the importance of the seventh-day Sabbath.
But he's very articulate
Yeah.
and strong. I think that he's a fairly opinionated guy.
Nothing wrong with that, of course, Jen.
And
Not necessarily.
he made it plain that that's still the position of the Orthodox Church today.
Yeah.
He said they have a Friday evening Vespers to welcome the Sabbath. They're at the seminary. He said they don't observe it. They don't feel like they have to observe it as a Sabbath now because God understands, things are different, but they still consider it to be the Sabbath.
The letter from Jesus. Yeah, unpack a little bit of that story. Called also
Well,
the epistle from Jesus, the letter from Jesus.
Interesting is that story was used over and over.
By different,
over a period of 4 or 5 centuries, the Catholic Church needed a little bit of impetus to their evangelism efforts. And so they would come up with this story about a letter coming down from heaven.
Now, in fairness, when you say Catholic Church, you're talking about local priests, because the hierarchy disavowed the letter. True or false?
False.
Okay.
I don't think there was any,
Well,
disavowal.
at different times there were different reactions to it. The letter apparently came to light first of all.
Let's just, for the sake of those watching this DVD,
Yeah.
what's the content of the letter?
Well, the content of the letter, it first of all purports to be written by the hand of Jesus.
Okay.
Right?
All right. So the letter comes down from
Yep.
heaven and lands on this altar.
And all it is really is a bunch of instructions and threats having to do with the proper observance of Sunday.
Of Sunday.
Yeah. So
People are slipping there.
So poor sheep, gullible sheep would, when the letter is read up front, say, well, we got our orders.
Your people are terrified because first of all, they don't read. There's not much education there. And they're told that if they do things on Sunday, that they should work on Sunday, they're going to suffer for it. If they bake bread on Sunday, it's not going to get baked. It'll sit in the oven as dough all day till Sunday's over. If one story is somebody's cutting bread and blood flows out of it
because they baked it on.
because they baked it on Sunday. Another guy,
So this is all in the letter, giving
Right.
these
All these
warnings.
horrible-
If you do this,
horrible
if you don't
results.
honor Sunday.
Right.
Yeah.
This guy goes out in his field and works on Sunday, and his plow gets caught in his leg or his foot, and it stays there the rest of his life. I mean, these things are ridiculous. You think, how could they possibly happen? But they were designed to just terrify people.
Now, I'm not going to tell the story that's on part 3 about the priest from France.
Yeah.
But I want to go back to something you said, Jim. Not all hierarchy react the same way to the letter.
We have evidence of the letter being used in Spain.
Okay.
We have the stories that we tell in
Well,
part 3, which is Ireland and
England, in the 12th century even.
Yes.
So
And there actually are.
And it's the same letter.
Oh, it's the same. It's
Very similar.
basically
Or variations
basically
on
the
the theme.
same letter.
Okay.
But we even find evidence of this letter in Ethiopia, and we find evidence of this letter being used in the centuries since then, up to fairly recently. All right. So even though
But the hierarchy, again,
even though there have been official statements from the highest levels of the Roman Catholic hierarchy, for example, yet the letter persists, and we find that maybe it was denied as being authentic at one point, and then later on maybe it was used as authentic. Not only that, but just in some recent reading that I've done, I have found that even though some pope or archbishop might condemn this letter, at the same time, well-respected mainline people within the Catholic hierarchy, bishops and so forth, were preaching things that are exactly the same as you find written in the letter. So obviously this idea of, number one, beginning to bring Sunday, bringing a Sabbath aura to Sunday.
To Sunday sanctity.
Yes, certainly was happening. All right, and the idea, not only that of bringing this idea of now this is the holy rest day, but also becoming quite legalistic in the way that it was to be observed. This, Dwight, would be the Sabbathizing of Sunday, turning Sunday into a Sabbath.
Let's take another. And again, I don't want to divulge too much because this is, for me, was a fascinating part of part 3 of Patrick. But let's do a little bit of a correction of history here. Patrick, when my wife is born, Karen's born on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, all right? So he's a saint, he's Irish, and he's Roman Catholic. And come to find out,
he's not Roman Catholic. He was never sainted, and he's from Scotland.
and he's not Irish. So there went that holiday.
Yeah, right.
And why do we drink and wear green?
Must be the Irish
You know,
connection.
there's the mythical Patrick and the real Patrick.
Okay. And you, in your research, found the real Patrick.
Right.
Fascinating.
And we
bit
weren't
of,
the first people to uncover him, obviously, but it is true. You know, we should point out that if you go to Roman Catholic scholars, they have an alternative story, you know, about this whole thing. But there has been so much revision of history.
Yeah.
And we're all guilty of that, aren't we?
and we're all-
Let's be
yeah,
fair.
yeah.
We all do a little bit of revisionist thinking in our own circles and communities of faith.
But what is quite clear, Dwight, is this, that Patrick was born into a Celtic Christian environment, all right? And the Celtic Christians, it's quite clear from the documentation that Celtic Christians observed Sabbath. Okay?
They were pretty apostolic in their faith.
Yeah.
You know, Rome hadn't influenced them yet.
To be continued on part 3. But let's talk about the Marian Sabbath. A seventh-day Sabbath devoted to Mary. Is that it?
Right.
And what's the story behind that?
Well, this goes back actually into the Dark Ages. And there have been people who have been particularly devoted to Mary, throughout the Dark Ages and into the Middle Ages and so forth, or rather into Reformation times and beyond. But here's the deal, to make it official. Pope Urban II, this was the Pope that called for the First Crusade, all right?
Okay.
At a church council, I believe in 1095, made it official that Sabbaths, and maybe not every single Sabbath in the calendar, but many, many of them that were not assigned to other saints would be devoted to Mary. All right? And this was explained on several grounds. Number one, that Christ himself, before he was born, rested within the womb of Mary. Just as God rested from his act of creation, the incarnate Christ rested in the womb of Mary, and so the Sabbath, the day of rest, is devoted. There's also a belief that somehow Jesus appeared to Mary on that Sabbath, on the crucifixion Sabbath.
While he's in the tomb.
While he's in the tomb. Yeah.
Interesting.
And there are other rationales involved there too.
What about this Ignatius Loyola connection with the Marian Sabbath?
Well, Ignatius Loyola formed the Society of Jesus
Right.
during
Became the Jesuits.
during the Spanish Inquisition.
Okay.
Right? At about the time, or just shortly prior to the time that this actually happened, Ignatius was, or I guess we should call him Loyola. Loyola was called in by the Inquisitors and questioned about his Sabbath keeping. Now, the reason why this was so important to the Inquisitors is this. The Spanish Inquisition was targeting Jews who had converted to Christianity and yet maintained some of their Jewish practices, including keeping the Sabbath.
Which would prove that they really were still Jews at heart.
Yeah, and
So they wanted to get Ignatius to grill him to find out, are you?
Why are you keeping the Sabbath? This
Yeah.
is what the Jews are doing.
So what did he say?
So he says, I am honoring the Sabbath in honor of Mary. I'm devoted to Mary, and that's the reason.
That's the
and he said,
connection.
besides that, I wouldn't do anything Jewish. Up in the country where I live, the part of the country where I live, there are no Jews up there. I didn't get this from them. This is my practice of devotion to Mary. Well, it was a well-established Catholic practice today, and by the way, it is still an established part of Catholic liturgy. There are special prayers to be offered, masses to be said
On Marian Sabbaths.
On Marian Sabbaths.
Pat, let's talk about, go back to the Nestorians. We were discussing that in the previous part. But this Nestorian monument, what's up with that?
Yeah, that was a fascinating story. And about the year 1625, these guys were digging, and they outside the walls of the city of Chang'an, or Xi'an. It's where all those terracotta soldiers were found a few years ago.
All right, yep.
And they hit something, and it turned out to be a monument stone, and the date on it was the year 781. So it had been buried almost 1,000 years, 900 years. And the top of the monument stone, the characters said something to the effect, in commemoration of the coming of the people from Tachin or Palestine, bringing with them the luminous religion. And the whole stone, has about 1,900 Chinese characters, and it had about 50 words in Estrangelo, which is like Aramaic, with the names of these missionaries. And it described them as people, coming from evidently various parts of the world and bringing with them this religion.
Now, you said luminous religion. I mean, what's the clue there?
They said that this religion lightens darkness with its brilliant precepts. And we call it the luminous religion.
Would that be Christianity?
Christianity.
All right.
And the Sabbath connection, this is one of those stories that we couldn't include on our DVD.
Why?
Because we've been so careful to make sure that everything we include is well documented and that anyone can find the same thing we found. There's not a lot of documentation for a holy day in Christianity in early China. There is plenty of documentation for Christianity coming to China between the 6th, 8th, 9th century, and there were old manuscripts found that date back as far as the 8th century. There was a Gospel of John, a Gospel of Matthew, there's a hymn, sung to the Trinity. All of these were found, in
Wow.
caves and in old cities. But there's very little mention of a holy day. But on this monument stone, there's a line that says to the effect, and it's translated either every 7 days or every seventh day. And we're told by scholars that either is correct. They said that we purify ourselves, we purify our hearts, and we meet together and have a sacrifice. And it sounds like it could be referring to a holy day or a religious meeting, but because we've never been able to find anything else that refers to that, we really can't say for sure that's what it is.
And
you
there are
know?
numerous
So you left that
translations.
out of the.
So we couldn't,
lineup
we
with Hal
couldn't include
Holbrook.
it, but it's a fascinating little piece. And
And-
if we were doing the broader subject of the church in the wilderness, just Christianity in general, we would have a lot to say about Christianity in China in the 8th century,
Yeah, because you said what, 780s?
781.
781.
But there have been numerous
Wow.
translations of this thing,
Yeah,
and there's just not unanimity among them as to the actual
How to render that?
exactly how to render it.
We have, I
Now-
think I have 8 different translations
Yeah.
of it.
You really?
Yeah.
Now, besides China, there's some, and the Nestorian monument. There've been some other pieces of archaeology, historical artifacts that seem to suggest.
There's a graveyard in southern Siberia. It had all these cute little round gravestones, and the dates on them are from 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th century.
Okay.
Over a period of several hundred years, and the inscriptions on them name the people, something about them. They show, they'll name someone and say so and so, the wife of the priest such and such, so that it showed that this Christianity had a married priesthood.
Okay.
For example, and one of the stones says, so and so who died on the Sabbath day.
Who died
So
on the
it's a little,
Sabbath
it's
day.
another little clue, a little piece that
Not
would be
rock hard evidence.
right. It's interesting, and another thing that was interesting about it is the names on those gravestones are international. They show that people, they'll say, from such and such a place, they show that they came, from the East and from the Middle East both.
Wow.
So it was sort of an international Christian community, perhaps.
Albigensians, Jim.
Albigensians were unfortunately the target of the first organized Inquisition.
The first.
The first organized Inquisition. Yeah.
Refresh our memories. Where are they from?
Okay. Well,
Southern France,
geographically?
Southern France,
France, yeah.
they had a republican style of government, representative style of government. They were very successful, productive people. They had farms, gardens, cities. They were also very, very tolerant. There were Muslims among them, and there were Jews among them, and they lived well with each other. They lived in peace and harmony with each other. But the Pope wanted the King of France to help him get rid of these people. And so that's really when the first Crusades were organized. And, the
The
soldiers...
first Crusades were against the Albigensians.
well, there was a crusade.
Yeah.
It was not the first crusade.
That
because
wasn't
the
the
first
Middle
crusade
Eastern
obviously
crusade, right.
went to Palestine. But see, these people are known historically not only as the Albigensians, they're known as the Cathari. All right, and that word actually means, I believe, the pure.
The term Albigensi really it was given to them because they were people who came from the city of
City of
Albi.
Albi, yeah.
So what happened is, there were people that held a much more fundamental view of Christianity and who had the Bible in their own language, dating back to the 11th, 10th, 11th, 12th century, up in the mountains, southern Italy, northern France, that area.
And they would not accept the authority of.
They refused to
Are they
accept...
Sabbatarians?
There were Sabbatarians among them.
Among them.
We can't say that they were, they include the Waldenses. In fact, the term Waldense really was a big term that covered a lot of people. It's a broad term, and underneath it were, the Catholic Church, in order to separate them when they were trying to eliminate them, sort of renamed them. They would name them after a local leader or the town where they were. So the Albigenses were called after the town of Albi, where they lived. There were Henricians, who followed a man named Henry, and there were Petrobutians, and there were Pasagini. And among those, all of those groups, we have references to the Sabbath. Petrobutians were Sabbath keepers, Henricians, Albigenses.
Really?
And, we just find little bits and pieces that refer to the fact that they kept the Sabbath, and that was one of the things the church had against them.
Now, the Inquisition somehow gets tied into the Albigenses, doesn't it?
first of all, there was a crusade. Now, this was not the crusade
Not
to
to
Holy
the
Land,
Middle East.
but there was a crusade to southern France, really,
Yeah.
to wipe out these people. But what's interesting is that even though there was this crusade and huge numbers of people were killed, it didn't work. The way that the Albigensians were finally really destroyed, in fact, they virtually disappeared from history in the 14th century, was the what we would call the medieval Inquisition, which was simply an organization and a formalizing of some things that had already been happening. See, but I think it was Pope Innocent who in I think 1231 or somewhere in the 1200s anyway. That date has escaped me, but he decides with this church council that there will be this operation, this very, very organized, insidious machine that would grind and grind and grind until there was nothing left to grind.
Yeah.
And it involved people being coerced to report on other people and so forth. And that.
In fact, you show some pictures
Yeah.
in the segment here.
We
that
had a
just
lot
make you
of-
cringe and say, "Oh boy."
We had a lot of really graphic old etchings, that we couldn't show. They're just too horrifying.
Yeah.
What people went through. There's that crusade attacked the city of Béziers in southern France, and there's a famous saying that came out of that. The papal soldiers are going in and they're told to slaughter everyone, and they said to the legate, how are we going to know who's Catholic and who's heretics here? And he said, kill them all, God will know his own.
You get up, I think it's in part 3, you get up to the English Isles again. Patrick, we were there, but then you come back to John Wycliffe, the morning star of the Reformation,
Yeah.
a great, a hero of mine.
Well, I was just
Yeah,
going to say, go ahead.
Yeah, because somehow you tie him in to the Sabbatarian connection. How's that work?
Yeah, he believed that every person could understand the Bible, and that was a radical concept in a society that believed that only a priesthood could interpret Scripture. But he wanted the Bible to be available to every person, and said even the plowboy should be able to understand the Scriptures for himself.
And that's really the genesis of the English translation, isn't it?
Sure.
Of
sure.
Holy
Yeah,
Scripture.
that's right.
Yeah. What was new for me when I watched part 3 is the connection with the Lollards. Of course, I know the Lollards and John Wycliffe,
Right.
but the connection to the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Not all Lollards, but to unpack that just for a moment. Jim,
Well,
Pat,
of course,
Jim.
they believed the Bible was the Word of God, and that you believe every word that you find in the Bible. And when they found the Sabbath in the Bible, it struck them.
The documented connection, if we can go there,
Sure.
probably would go to perhaps the year 1402, 1401, 1402, where there is a rather obscure record of a trial in England that involved a man by the name of John Seigneau. Now he's actually mentioned there in part 3, but his trial, along with with 2 or 3 others that were tried with him, involved his observance of the Sabbath. So that is the first little hint. But there's another line here. In our talking with folks over in England about this, we were told that in the places, in the villages and towns, the valleys, where the Lollards had been strongest, where they had really put down their roots, it was in those places, in those very same families from those very same locations, that the Baptist movement arose. And of course, the Seventh-day Baptist movement eventually arose among those Baptists. So there have been some people who've been studying that very thing, the bridge between the Lollards and the people who lived in the same areas 2 or 3 centuries later.
Wow. You had a great lineup of experts. We've already talked about Dragus.
Right.
Let's talk about Leslie Harding. He did some of your seminal research. I mean, the book provided some strong historical foundation for your research.
It was actually his doctoral dissertation.
Was it his
Yeah,
dissertation?
on the Celtic Church in Britain.
Britain.
Yeah, it's some pretty heavy reading, some of it, but it's very, very thorough, very, very solidly documented.
You had an expert, Bartlett.
Robert Bartlett is an interesting story. He is a professor at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland.
All right.
He's actually married to an American woman. And he taught, I think, at the University of Chicago as well. In fact, somebody who watched that part 3, some other expert that I was talking to, was sort of commenting on our experts, and he pointed out this fellow Bartlett as one of the most highly respected, regarded of all of our experts.
Well, kudos to you for finding him.
Well, he was a natural choice because of his field of expertise. But Dwight, there's an interesting story in connection with Bartlett. I went to visit him, I guess 2 or 3 months before we actually went and taped his interview. And I was armed with documentation, with quotations, a lot of stuff from Pat's earlier research. And I sat there in his office, in this old ancient building here in this little wooden office with books, all around on all the walls and so forth, and a wooden table behind me. And here he is at his desk. And we're having a fairly pleasant visit. And I mentioned some point that I had read in the notes that I had brought with me. And I said something about the evidence of Sabbath keeping among Protestants in Scotland. He said, "Oh, that never happened." And I said, "Well, I have a quotation here, a citation from a book," and I gave him the name of the book. And he said, "Well, I have that book in my library, I believe." He said, "You wait right here." So I sat in his office and waited for maybe 10 minutes.
Really?
While he went down and went through the library there in that school, and he came back with the book. Well, first of all, I looked at my own notes, and somehow in communicating them to him, he was looking for the wrong page, and he found the page that he thought was the right page, and he said, "No, it's not here." I said, "Wait a minute, that's not the right page." And I verified what the page was, and we turned to that page in the book. This was an amazing lesson. This was an old book, Dwight.
Old meaning?
It was a book that may have been published back in the 1800s.
Okay.
All right. And at that time, the binding of books was sort of an inexact operation. And sometimes when books were bound, when the pages were trimmed, some pages would be missed. Some pages were misaligned. And it happened.
Not trimmed at the top.
Not trimmed at the top. So in other words, that book, that page was a closed page. I mean, you've probably had
I've
books like
seen
that.
this,
You
sure.
take a letter opener or a jackknife and open the page. That's what happened to that page.
At that very page that you were trying to find.
That man had never laid eyes upon that page in that book.
Isn't that something?
Neither had anyone else.
And neither, that page had never seen the light of day. All right. And it was a lesson to me that there are holes in the research that is done even by the greatest academics, and there may be truths that they have missed.
I really think that's such an important point. Through history, the Sabbath has been a non-issue. And so people doing research haven't made note of that particular thing as they go along. You don't find it, you don't find reference to it often, and it may not be because it's not there, but just because it wasn't of any interest to whoever was researching.
And the other side of that, and this is probably even more scary, the other side of that is that in many cases, the evidence is disappearing. You see?
Well,
Stuff is being lost.
Yeah.
don't know how I can touch that one.
Yeah.
But that's a fascinating thought.
Yeah. There's stuff that's been lost.
I think from my exposure to these 5 powerful presentations, the drama coming up in part 4, it has to be one of your strongest, was one of the strongest moments for me. And when we come back, I want to get into part 4 and the whole Moscow, Russian connection with Sabbatarians.